item is a report from the DEI short-term task force. So this is an item that we've brought before you in previous meetings, and the intent today is to really hear in full the recommendations from the short-term task force and really help us prepare for the recommendations to be advanced to the full council for consideration on August 19th. So I think what we're looking for is just some assistance in making sure that this is being framed appropriately, so that we can get full consideration of the council in a few weeks. So I'm going to turn it over to Shelley to kind of introduce. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Rook, who's going to be facilitating the presentation. Hopefully, Aaron has been able to work out the audio issues.
And then, Eric, if you might just to remind everybody that who are not speaking to mute their microphones.
Yes, thank you for the reminder. WebEx is notorious for some of the audio issues. So yes, please do, Mike. We'll try to do that too from the host perspective, but let's watch that closely. So Aaron, are you able to take over from here?
Sure, yeah. Juan doesn't mind pulling up those slides. Happy to kind of talk through it there. Basically went back to the subcommittee since last we met with you all, and folks made some modifications based on feedback. If we want to go ahead and go to the first slide there.
Aaron, I'm sorry to interrupt. We really need everybody to mute. Thank you.
Theoretically, I think the host might have the power to mute people themselves, if that's all. So just a reminder, we're Allyship in Action. We've been working with the city on a contract to support some of the council and city goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Leanne, I think, is also on the phone with us here if there are any questions that she can be helpful in answering, but really just going to go over where the task force landed with those recommendations, and I'm looking forward to getting feedback from the subcommittee. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And the next one, I suppose. Title pages are lovely, but there's not much to say there. So one thing that came up in conversations, so just I guess to refresh, we had 2 meetings of the DEI short-term task force since the last time we were at the Stewardship Subcommittee meeting. And so had an opportunity for that group to kind of look over the recommendations in light of the feedback that came from both the Stewardship Subcommittee members of city staff, and also just to reflect on, the ways in which, we're in a different space now than we were, last time that they had met. So in that conversation, one of the things that came up was the idea of having some guiding principles to kind of frame the understanding of those recommendations. And so this kind of represents what the group was talking about in terms of how they, kind of the prerequisites they see and understandings to make this all work. And so what they articulated was that to achieve the equity and inclusion goals of City Council and to ensure the success of the work of the Human Rights and Equity Commission, that the City of Bend, under the direction of the city manager, should be directed to apply equity and social justice foundational practices to city actions and endeavor to integrate these practices into the city's strategic, operational, and business plans, management and reporting systems for accountability and performance, and budgets in order to eliminate inequities and create opportunities for all people and communities. And that really just kind of came out of a conversation around the recognition that while, the recommendations for council and the work of council broadly is often external facing, that the internal city practices and culture also inform how the city engages with the broader community. So wanting to kind of have it on all levels there. I don't know if there are any questions about kind of the guiding principles on this slide. Yeah.
Erin, thanks so much. Loving the ombre hair there today. Is it true we don't have a Human Rights and Equity Commission yet? That's part of the work that's going on is deciding what all they're going to do in establishing that commission. Is that correct?
So yeah, the great question. It gets a little cart before the horse there if you but the way we framed it, rather, not your question.
Okay.
But the recommendations will include speaking to that idea of a Human Rights and Equity Commission. And so you could, I suppose, fill in the blank with, whatever ends up being formed, right? Just that recognition that, there needs to be a culture and practices at the city internally to support that external work. It's a great question. Thanks, Barb. If we could go to the next slide, please. So additionally, within those guiding principles, and you may recognize this from, I believe it was in the recommendations previously in another section kind of under recommendations, but the group really took that feedback about wanting to make it more concise and easier to digest. And so thought that some of these things more appropriately belonged in guiding principles. And so this piece, it was that the application, membership, and services of the commission that is created, as well as all city committees, should be accessible to all. And while that's a pretty broad statement, the group wanted to highlight a few particular types of folks, right, just to make sure that those folks are being thought of. So including community members who don't read, write, or speak English, community members of all immigration statuses, those without access to kind of the personal technology that we often rely on, computers, printers, smartphones, etc. Those who may be caring for children or others, those without an access to a vehicle or rideshare services, right, who might be relying on public transportation and things of that nature, as well as community members with diverse abilities and access needs, including those who have mental, sensory, physical, intellectual, developmental disabilities, or any others, right? Certainly not an exhaustive list, but I think gives an example of a variety of abilities and access needs. Yeah, Bruce, did you have a question?
Aaron, if I could ask a question, and I actually want to preface it by saying, I'm really excited. I think, Aaron, I think you and others did a good job of consolidating down what we saw after the last short-term task force meeting, and I'm totally supportive of where this is going. One of my questions, and I actually raised it at that last meeting, was help me understand, and this may just simply be a misunderstanding on my part, help me understand kind of who the commission is for, because I got a sense, at least from feedback from some of the people on the short-term task force, that the commission really was for the purpose of the individuals and to help provide them with a platform and an opportunity to participate. Whereas I clearly recognize that there need to be people among all these lists that are on this, but it's really for broader work on BIPOC within the community. And so is the commission being set up for those individuals and for their benefit, or the larger community? Because from my perspective, I'll just say, like, some of these things, like, I don't want to come across as being exclusive, but logistically, how committee meetings and how they work and how they function like that, those are going to make somebody less effective from my perspective, if you want somebody to be engaging the broader community. If it's just about for an individual serving, then these are fine. I don't know, Barb or Chris, do you guys understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I hear you, Bruce, and I think it would be good maybe to expand more or less on the logistics and so forth, how all this fits together based on what Councilor Knapp was pointing out, just to get defining on the association itself and membership participation in committee makeup.
Yeah, Bruce, I was able to be on for the last meeting of the task force, and there was some discussion there, and I've given it some thought. I think it's true in particular with regard to that first bullet point. The others, it seems like, Bruce, if I've got this right, were the third, if somebody didn't have a computer or a smartphone or a printer, and then the fifth, whether or not they had access to a vehicle or ride share. So the third and the fifth, I think we could accommodate those. I think we could find a computer in our IT department to loan out to somebody. And we counselors just recently have been given those little personal hotspots, which mean that if I'm not mistaken, you don't need any kind of connection at your home at all for that little hotspot to work. And then the other Oh, and childcare also, you know, we don't want their need for childcare to stand in the way. That's another one. I think we could do vouchers. I've looked into this before for folks interested in any city committees. And I spoke to the city manager at that point, and it seemed like we might be able to give vouchers to people so they could afford a babysitter or childcare for their own child. And then that last one of ride share, same thing there. I think we could give somebody vouchers for an Uber or a Lyft. So as far as those three, I do think we could make, in the world of education, you call it the appropriate accommodations and modifications, right? And for those three, I don't think the appropriate accommodations be too burdensome. But that first one, that read, write, or speak English, that really is quite problematic, I think, for discussing with the other community members. Bruce, what if we were to change that, something about English does not need to be their first language, some kind of wording like that?
I'm fine with that. Chris, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add on that number one, an example that worked really well here, Barb, was when we were the mayor and city manager and I were doing a city update for COVID-19 to the Latino community. And we had an interpreter with us, and it was really effective and well received. And so I think that there might be something here, Aaron, where we could have an interpreter of this, and also making sure the materials that are prepared are bilingual.
So I'm hearing two questions, I guess there are two main topics, if I can speak to those real quick. One, I think the first question I heard from Bruce was, who is the commission for? Right, and I think that's a good question to ask. My sense, and certainly members of the task force who are present are welcome to correct me if I'm misrepresenting, is that at the end of the day, it's for everyone. You know, it serves everyone, right? It serves the community, it serves the city, it serves council. But I think from my perspective, it's understandable that a task force of community members might emphasize the ways in which a group like that serves the community. And I think my sense was that was kind of what was asked for, right? Was to get that community perspective. But my sense from the conversations the task force had was that there's an understanding that it would be a benefit on all levels, right? The other question I see coming up is around logistics, right? Around how, you know, if the city is and council are to abide by these guiding principles, what does that look like on a practical level? I appreciate Chris you speaking to the recent meeting that LCA was involved in. I caught the tail end of that. I think it was a good example of how that can work, right? Like using interpreters, translators, things of that nature. I think also worth highlighting that, well, I think we are, you know, kind of default position is to think, oh, well, how will Spanish speakers communicate with English speaking members of the community? But what we're maybe not thinking about is that with the way things are currently set up, we're still missing a part of the community, right? So Spanish speakers in the community aren't getting that information that's only being made accessible in English. So just something to think about there. I think with regard to the other pieces, you know, it's a matter of being creative, right? A little bit. And also just recognizing that there's different ways to engage with folks. I don't imagine that, you know, I suppose it's possible, but I don't imagine you'd end up with a commission where not a single person had access to a computer, right? And can, you know, take on different.
And I want to be really clear about what I was and was not saying here. I have no problem with these being the guiding principles, and I have no problem with these being things that put people on the commission. I'm simply saying, as somebody who might be in an interviewing mode or something along those lines, not having been able to communicate with other people and or the broader community, that's going to, in my opinion, make them less effective as an overall commission member. And people can totally disagree with me. They may have wonderful other values, but to me, the ability to communicate broadly is an important value. I'm simply raising that. I think all of the combinations that Barb said, I'm totally supportive of. I was just raising that as a logistical issue.
Can I clarify maybe? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, Aaron, I was just going to say, I think you summarized that very well. And I think maybe one of the other guiding principles here is that, this is new territory for all of us. So I think we have to, go in not knowing what we don't know and how this will evolve, but to understand that we, have to be nimble in this development. So I think with that, we'll learn from those that are participating and want to make sure that we keep that as an open conversation so that we can learn and understand, where we need to improve. So I think there might be something there as an add-on or just making sure that people don't feel pressured that we will scale to this and that we will be nimble and address those concerns as we go. Like you said, this is not an exhaustive list. I think this list is a start to formulate. I believe too that we have to understand it's going to grow and there's some parts here that could change. But I think it's a great start, great direction. I'm excited about moving forward here. So Aaron, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
Aaron.
Of course.
I'm like the Visa card. I'm everywhere you want to be. The other issue that came up in that task force, I am so glad to see that you addressed that in that very first statement, that this is this commission and all city committees. That was something that came up in that task force. Number one, just legally, we can't make something different for one than the other. And then as a guiding principle, yeah, why wouldn't all of our committees have folks that don't have English as their first language or don't own a car? And, so I really do. I think this is a really great list. And if we can move forward from this, we've got a great start.
Thanks, Barb. Are there other questions or comments about the guiding principles, or do we want to move forward to some of the content of the recommendations? I apologize if you can hear my dog whining in the background.
Yeah, Aaron, I think we're ready to move forward.
Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
All right, so a lot of this will look probably familiar to some of the things we've seen in the past, but the first recommendation and kind of the priority that really emerged from the group was to establish a Human Rights and Equity Commission with that name, and so essentially to adopt an ordinance establishing a permanent and independent Human Rights and Equity Commission that's focused on responding to the needs and priorities of historically marginalized and underrepresented communities and providing feedback on issues related to diversity, equity, or inclusion in the city of Bend, and then identifying some particular roles that they would want that group to have. So I don't know if there's questions about kind of just this initial piece of it, but the kind of the meat of it is in the upcoming slides. So we can talk through those if you want, and then circle back to this piece.
Yeah, I think it will help moving forward and getting to the meat of it, and we can circle back if there's questions on this intro.
Hey, Aaron, I'll just jump in at this point, and Chris, because I don't think you were there, but Barb was, and Jenna was able to at the last short-term task force meeting. And again, we've been talking about this commission versus committee, et cetera, and I think we were like, does it matter? What? And one of the things that we heard loud and clear was, yep, it matters. It matters to the task force. And I'm like, well, that's good enough for me. And so, from my perspective, I'm supportive of the name we have right there with the Human Rights and Equity Commission.
Great, thanks for that feedback. Did anyone else have anything they want to say about that? Also, I might carry my computer with me and turn off the video while I feed my dog, but I'm very much still here.
Okay, Aaron, you can.
Yeah, you go ahead and proceed.
Turn your video, feed your dog.
Yeah, we can move to the. I can walk and talk though. It's all good. It's just.
I can totally relate. My dog usually ends up in my lap on these meetings, so.
Right, yeah. So, again, kind of starting out with that key role being around investigating and responding to complaints of discrimination or violations of the Bend Equal Rights Ordinance, and highlighting kind of two particular ways in which it would see doing that. One would be to assist impacted parties in connecting to and navigating the community resources to access care, support, education, or resolution, but also looking into developing and facilitating non-punitive resolutions such as mediation or restorative justice, of course, supported by appropriate education and resources. My dog just wanted to really emphasize that point with a yip at the end, so make sure everybody heard it right. So now I can go through the rest of it if there are questions about that particular piece, but additionally, one of the roles that the task force articulated was to advise City Council on issues relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion, including the equity impacts of policies and practices, the needs and priorities of marginalized and underrepresented communities, and strategies to increase engagement with these groups.
Aaron, I have a question. Maybe Eric, you might be able to help on this. Under advising City Council on issues, so this would come with, I'm just trying to visualize this and understand the process. Would the advising come directly from the Human Rights and Equity Commission, or would it come to the Stewardship Commission and then go up to council? Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the issue. So as we scope out the committee, and remember, part of the recommendation to the full council based on these recommendations is how to form a code that really formalize this commission in the eyes of council. But our kind of intent with the use of subcommittees is those issues that are fairly complex and that might that we want to engage council in a more in a deeper way, that we typically bring in front of the committee first to help frame it. So not every committee recommendation or issue would necessarily go through the stewardship subcommittee, but to the extent that there's work plan items that just are going to require a lot more engagement, that we will probably use the stewardship subcommittee as there's two council subcommittees. I would imagine continuing to use this subcommittee as a point of contact for this commission.
Okay, thank you. Clarifies it.
And then also the kind of creating and providing regular guidance and feedback on the implementation of a diversity, equity, and inclusion action plan for the city. So kind of speaking to that piece that was in the council goals, right, about creating an action plan. And the task force, felt it was important to have a relationship that would involve feedback and follow up on that plan, and that it be responsive to the evolving needs of historically marginalized and underrepresented communities, as well as the capacity of council and staff, right? Recognizing that there's not endless capacity and it has to make sense within the available resources. Any questions, comments on this piece before we move to the next one?
No questions from me. Barb?
All right. We can always come back later if they come to you as we move forward. So the second piece there on the next slide is broadly about removing barriers to service at the city. So that includes reviewing the standard city committee or commission application, which I gather city staff has already started looking at prior to the establishment of the Human Rights and Equity Commission, and removing all unnecessary barriers to engagement by historically marginalized and or underrepresented groups, and ensuring that the membership for the commission and other committees is open and accessible. One thing I'll speak to just to kind of emphasize here is that there was conversation about, is this something that the commission could work on addressing, or is this something that should be addressed before the commission is formed? And I think there, were a lot of folks that were in favor of this happening in advance, right? So that the Human Rights and Equity Commission could benefit from that more accessible and open process. Any questions, comments, thoughts on number 2?
No, I was kind of in that thought process too, Aaron, about, keeping the focus in advance of this, so we can begin to proceed immediately going forward with this.
Excellent. Well, then we can move on to number 3, I think. And that's about, and again, a conversation that I know is happening at the city around offsetting the costs of participation in order to increase access. So looking into establishing the means and the process to provide financial compensation, whether it's a stipend or, like you're saying, blood vouchers, things, whatever that might look like, to commission members that request it to offset the costs of participation. So things like we mentioned, childcare, transportation, lost wages, et cetera, because we know that that can be a barrier sometimes, right, to folks participating. Questions on this one before we move to number 4? All right, moving right along then. Creating a diverse and representative commission, obviously, I think is important. The task force wanted to ensure that the membership of the commission includes a majority of members who identify as a member of one or more historically marginalized or underrepresented communities, kind of first and foremost, but then had some other thoughts about ways to create that diverse and representative commission that are on the next slide. So I think we could move on to the next one, probably perfect. And so this was described, so in order to define the, who are we talking about when we talk about historically marginalized or underrepresented communities, this is not an exhaustive list, but some examples of who might fall into those categories, right? People of color, LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, et cetera. And I think the idea was that that would be a self-identified kind of thing, right? Honor system in that sense. Folks were interested in having at least one member who identified as Native or Indigenous, with preference for folks that would have a local connection to, a connection to one of our local tribal communities in order to kind of maintain that relationship. They wanted it to be inclusive of folks who live or work in Bend or otherwise consider Bend their community. I know other cities in their framing of similar committees or commissions will often say things like, live, work, worship, et cetera, right? Kind of whatever categories make sense to represent folks that are really engaged in this community. They asked that, it include folks who are as reflective as possible of the diverse, historically marginalized and underrepresented communities in Bend, folks who have experience of some sort, broadly defined, working around diversity, equity, and inclusion or other community organizing. That could be demonstrated a variety of ways, including through a resume, references, or responses to DEI-related questions, which is something that they strongly encourage to be part of the application process. And then in terms of numbers, thinking about something probably between 9 and 15. I think it's probably standard practice to go for an odd number, right? So you don't end up with split decisions. But thinking in terms of what is a sufficient number in order to represent Bend's historically marginalized and underrepresented communities, but also not so large that it would make it difficult to kind of effectively carry out the work of the commission. Are there questions or comments around kind of this the makeup of the committee piece or commission rather? Yeah, Barb.
Thank you. So is there any discussion about having women as an historically underrepresented community?
It's a great question. I don't know that it came up specifically, but that's something I think that, we could look at. And I don't know, we're working on getting some of this data now, but I'm not sure if you all have a general sense of kind of the gender breakdown of the committees and commissions as they stand, if that's an issue in the demographics as they are, but yeah, that's something we could take back to them and ask.
Hey, Erin, this is Leanne. I can actually speak to that. I actually peeked at the demographic survey that we sent out to committee members. And as of a few days ago, so folks still have until the close of business tomorrow, of the folks who responded to the survey, of which we have just under a 50% response rate, approximately 50% of committee members self-identified as women.
50% of the people who responded self-identified as women?
Yes, 50% of people responded. So I can't guarantee
so 25%. So we're sure that 25% of our committee members are women.
Yes, but potentially 50.
50%. Yeah. And thanks, Leanne, so much. I added it up a few years ago, and it got complicated because I serve on some committees that are not exclusively city. When I included those in, there's one where it's about, oh, it's maybe 30 to 3 women, something like that, 20 or 30 men, to 2 or 3 of us women. So I'd be, Leanne, I'd be really happy to talk to you about that. And thank you.
Yeah, and I think, while I, as I said, the committee, the task force didn't speak specifically to the question of gender in this way. My sense, based on the kind of spirit of the conversation, is that while I wouldn't, it might not be in line to put women as one of those with kind of in the same category as everybody else that's listed as a historically marginalized in this context. I think it would be something to keep in mind as folks are being selected, right? And I think it speaks to, I mean, in some ways, the kind of people who are as reflective of the community as possible, right? So wanting a level of gender parity that reflects the community. But I think what you could end up having happen if you included women as a kind of a group that you would include as a marginalized community. In that sense, you could potentially also end up with a committee that is, say, all white women, right? And so just kind of thinking about where, and I think certainly there are plenty of places where we still see less representation of women, and there are plenty of barriers still there. But that's, I think, what would probably, in my mind, better reflect maybe the spirit of what folks were talking about, just kind of having that awareness, certainly, of the gender makeup. But I can't, like I said, I can't speak to what the conversation was because it didn't come up. Are there other questions about kind of this framing of who the membership would be?
No questions. I think you've done an excellent job in framing it, Aaron, and allyship as a whole. So.
Thank you. I think credit goes to the task force as well for doing it. I think they did a great job of trying to
fantastic job. I am a little nervous about 15 people on a committee. So I'd be curious to know kind of, how effective that is versus having 9 and 11, because I've been on certain committees where 15, to your point, tends to not effectively carry out the work. And you may have had experience from that as well, based on your comment, and majority of us probably here as well. So I just want us to be cautious of that and really be hard about the number.
Yeah, and I think when we polled members a while back about kind of ideal number, and I think the most common response was 9 or 11. So I think the idea was just kind of in that window somewhere, you're recognizing what works and what doesn't. Great. Well, if there's not other conversation on this point, I think we can move to the next slide. I don't want to take up too much time because I know the city staff have also have things to share with you as well on this topic. So the last recommendation was really around providing appropriate staff support. So recognizing that, there will be a need for some kind of support, right? So to direct either a staff member or consultant to serve as a liaison between the commission and the city of Bend, to support the establishment, visioning, and development of the Human Rights and Equity Commission. And some of the things they thought that might include were, providing regular opportunities for members of the general public to provide feedback on the needs and priorities of historically marginalized and underrepresented communities. So kind of serving as that external point of contact, and also facilitating learning and resources to support the work of the commission, right? Because folks may be new to being on commissions, need that kind of basic education and support around doing that work, as well as making connections with elected officials, city leadership, and other decision makers. My thoughts, questions about this piece? I think there was definitely an awareness among the task force members that, it obviously depends on resources and capacity and all of that, but just wanting to articulate that.
Aaron, yeah. I had a question, and I can't remember whether it was Eugene or Beaverton, but my recollection was that on one of those, the commission itself did not hear actual direct individual complaints. The commission sort of was a level above. They were looking at sort of what are sort of the underlying themes or the driving forces that are causing these situations. So I guess that's one of my other questions, sort of logistically. I'm curious how the commission feels that the sort of creating a forum to hear complaints, is that something that's going to be done by the full commission, by a committee? One of the other, again, can't remember if it was Beaverton or Eugene, it sounded like it was the staff person who actually was the primary agent as far as providing the appropriate referral if there are other things. So I'm just sort of curious what's envisioned. And again, maybe it's a TBD, but this is higher level than, so I'm asking a more logistical question, how people think it's going to play out.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the longer version of the recommendations had a little more detail around that. And so there's that kind of trying to decide, what feels like too into the weeds. And again, if there are folks, Ramir, maybe others are on the call if they want to clarify too. But I think the conversations I recall were around the commission really tasking itself with figuring out what that looks like. What does a complaint process look like, right? Does it make sense for the commission to get those complaints directly? Does it make sense for them to filter through a staff person? Kind of what is that process look like? But I think the key priority that came through was just that be a function of that group in some way, or that it create that space. I don't know, Ramir, if you or if anyone else on the call wanted to speak more to that, but. There you go, Ramir.
There we are. Very briefly, I think if I speak for the rest of the task force, the idea in hearing complaints, I think the idea was that the commission should hear complaints. However, in the process of trying to implement that, we would seek certainly help from the city. If I recall correctly, Eugene has a procedure, the commission has a website, and people are allowed to register complaints through that website. I imagine that the website itself is administered by the city. There is a procedure that they establish where you said they have a form that you have to fill out indicating what the nature of your complaint is and providing other information relative to a particular complaint. And that gets processed and then considered by the commission that responds. So I think this would have to be a collaborative effort with help from the city.
Thanks, Ramir. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit, and maybe the conversation or the staff will be sharing about models will help provide some clarity on that.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about some of this when we talk about the models of both Eugene and Beaverton, which have this feature in their Human Rights Commission. So we can talk in a little more detail in a bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to support with what Mr. Chatterjee was saying about Eugene. They do have in part of their strategic plan that is noted, and is something that we could possibly utilize to help, clarify this and expand on and create our own. So thank you for bringing that up, Chatterjee.
So I think if there aren't quite more, oh, sorry.
Thank you. It's okay. Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. Thanks for all of your work on this. I was just going to make a comment about the last bullet point. This is something, Eric, I think this is something that is worth some time and effort. I'm imagining something that could be valuable for anybody even thinking about applying for a committee or a commission, and certainly for all new members of commissions, some sort of a packet of information that's helpful. Our excellent city recorder knows about videos that talk about our weird taxing system in Oregon, which of course affects every decision we make. I can envision this being, not just a good resource for this commission, but for, really all of us maybe. So thank you.
Great. So I think, if I remember correctly, that there may be one more slide, but that might be the last one that we have there that, oh, yes, just questions for discussion. So I don't know if there are any of the recommendations you want to circle back to that you have questions about, or if you're feeling ready to hear about models, but happy to elaborate on any of the points we just brought up.
Would you swing back? I think it was number 3, please. Either 3 or 4. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Juan.
Oh, this is another one where why wouldn't it be for all of our committees and commissions? You know, I just think that's an important consideration.
I don't think the task force was by no means opposed to that. I think they were just focused on this particular context. But yeah, absolutely. My sense is that folks support increasing access to all committees and commissions.
Of course. Great. I think that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions we can answer about the recommendations or the process or additional context?
I have no further questions.
Great.
I think the only one I would bring up, since it was brought up here, is just to bring some clarity around the complaint process. As I mentioned before, Eugene has a really good example.
Yeah, let's maybe that's a great segue. Let's go ahead and transition to Ian Lighthizer is going to cover the material in your packet that extensively talks about the Eugene and Beaverton models and that process in a little more detail. So maybe if we can go through that material, Councillor Piper, and then we can kind of address any remaining questions you have.
You took the segue away from me, Eric. So.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'll introduce this topic. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the short-term task force again. From my perspective, I thought it was a really great process and really good feedback, so thank you. I wanted to transition now to talking about, from a kind of the city perspective, we're not by any means blazing a trail here. There's other cities here in Oregon that have very similar models, and so we really honed in on both Eugene and Beaverton. So what you'll hear from Ian is more detail on those, and that can also maybe help inform how we might take the recommendations from the task force and create the code that would enable some of this work to occur as kind of outlined in our council goals, and would be a discussion for the full council to consider here in a few weeks. So I'll turn it over to Ian.
Thanks, Eric. Hello, everybody. I've got to acknowledge our wonderful law student intern, Emily, who helped gather a lot of this information from Eugene and Beaverton, and then put it into a form that hopefully is conveyable by me. So Juan is going to run the slideshow. We can move on to the next slide, which is a little bit of a table of contents. And while you look at that, let me just talk really quickly why we picked these two cities. Eugene and Beaverton they're not necessarily the cities out there most similar to Bend, but they're not entirely dissimilar, and they're two relatively local, i.e. in Oregon, examples of communities that have human rights commissions that seem to sort of be fairly similar and have the elements that the task force is recommending. So these two aren't exactly the same. They're to each other, and it's not necessarily the case that whatever we end up with, the council directs formation of something, is going to look exactly like Eugene or Beaverton. But the structures that they have in place, from what we've been able to gather, both from looking at their respective codes and calling folks in those cities, are fairly similar and fairly in line with what has developed from the task force. So we thought it might be useful to run through kind of how those bodies function in those particular communities, do a little bit of comparison and contrasting, and then maybe answer some questions about how those actually work. So let's move on to the next slide. One of the first things we wanted to get a handle on were questions about how these things actually work. What kind of staff resources do they require or are allocated to each of these committees? But what involvement do the lawyers have? That's a question that the lawyers asked, no surprise there. And then what kind of budget allocations do they entail? So we first looked at staff for each of these committees. They're a little bit different, and Eugene first. So when we look at Eugene, we need to remember that Eugene they have an office or a department. It's the Office of Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement. We don't really have that at the City of Bend. And so their Human Rights Commission is sort of structured in tandem, and I think a little bit adjacent to that administrative office they have, covering some of the same subject matter. So there is a staffer from their Office of Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement that is assigned to their Human Rights Commission. The staffer provides support to make sure that the work is getting done in a way that aligns with city processes and procedures, and I'll say probably state requirements in terms of public records and public meetings requirements, and sort of helps get the work ready when that work consists of making recommendations to Eugene's City Council. The staff doesn't interfere with or advocate for policy decisions, but provides assistance. So when you look at Beaverton, what we've been able to gather, and this is information that we put together by calling people, and thanks again to Emily for doing a lot of the legwork on that. It sounds to us like Beaverton's staff dedication might be a little bit less than Eugene. It's somebody that spends maybe 30 or maybe 60% of their time at the higher end more recently working with Beaverton's Human Rights Commission. I think in Beaverton, it's the Human Rights Advisory Commission. This person offers as a conduit between the commission and city staff, including the city manager and their city council, helps do a lot of the kind of the administrative work that helps the work move along in terms of preparing agendas, planning, communicating, but similar to Eugene, doesn't advocate or get involved in particular policy outcomes, decisions, or recommendations. That staffer does similar work to what the staff member in Eugene does in terms of helping the commission align its work with relevant policies and procedures, both city policies and procedures and applicable state law requirements. The committee, their committee includes a city council liaison, somebody from their police department, and a youth liaison. And we'll get into sort of committee composition a little bit later. So we also asked, what role do the lawyers have? And this is frankly an area where I was a little bit surprised, because in Eugene and Beaverton, it doesn't sound like their respective city attorney's offices, and each of those cities has an in-house city attorney's office like we do, but it doesn't sound like those offices are all that involved on sort of a regular doing the work basis.
I was really surprised by that. I was surprised by that too.
Right, and so that was my initial reaction, but you know, then you think about some of our boards and commissions, and frankly, our office is more involved with some than others. There, you know, BDAB is an example of one that runs without, certainly without constant involvement of the city attorney's office, and our involvement isn't really that regular. It's more on an ad hoc situational basis. There are other boards and commissions we have where we're more involved. I mean, Planning Commission is kind of a special case, but I'm thinking of the NLA, the Neighborhood Leadership Alliance, where our office has been pretty involved at every meeting and subcommittee meeting that body has had since it was formed a couple of years ago. So we do have a little bit of variation in our own boards and commissions. I will say that it's easy to say we like to be involved. However things end up, I will put in a plug for the city attorney's office being involved, especially as a board or commission is stood up, as they say, and gets their goals together, gets their work plan put together, and frankly just gets into the swing and the rhythm of doing the work and doing it in a way that complies with public meetings requirements, especially that those can be those are sort of, that's a new way to work for a lot of people, and that's something that all of our boards and commissions have to comply with. So however things end up, I think it's important for the lawyers to be involved early, really to assist the body in carrying out its work in an effective and legal way. But as you're seeing, Eugene and Beaverton don't have that regular involvement like we do with a lot of our boards and commissions. So budget, that's another area. There's a little bit of variation. It was interesting to see Eugene say they have some informal expenditure provision. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but it doesn't sound like it's that formalized, and there's no independent budget. Beaverton's example does have an independent budget. How big that is, I'm not sure if we know, but those cities apparently do it a little bit differently. So that's kind of an overview of sort of a resource comparison that we've been able to glean from these two examples. So let's move on to the next slide, and feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. This is really just a way to point you to your meeting materials. Pages 2 through 11 of the memo in your packet break down in a table form the task force recommendations and sort of analogs in the respective codes, really, from Eugene and Beaverton that go to those recommendations. So that involves a lot of code citations to codes that aren't ours. So I'm not going to go through that in this presentation. But one of the things we tried to do is not just look at the code. Like I mentioned, Emily called our counterparts in Eugene and Beaverton to find out how things actually work. And that's what this presentation is trying to convey. I think sometimes looking at the code can not really tell you the whole story. And I think that'll be especially evident when we talk about some of the enforcement roles. So let's move on to the next slide and get into the meaty part. So this is kind of a table that we put together. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. One of these is actually from Eugene. What we're looking at on the screen this is actually from Eugene. This is the way they characterize what their Human Rights Commission is and is not. In other words, what it does and doesn't do. I'm going to move through this really quickly, probably not look at Beaverton's in the interest of time, but that is available for you. So this is how Eugene sort of answers questions about their commission. It is an advisory body. It's not an enforcement agency. We'll get to that in a minute. It is made up of community volunteers and a liaison. It doesn't have city employees or paid commission members. It is a body that has members that are appointed. It does not have members that are elected. Some of these are pretty obvious. I think one of the key points is this fourth row. It is a group that seeks to amplify the voices who are or have been marginalized or excluded. It is not a group that only listens or answers to the city of Eugene, either their elected officials or influential members of the community. So let's move on to the next slide. I'm not going to go through this one by one. This is a continuation of the same content from Eugene. I think the most significant piece here as we look forward really is that first one. This is a body in Eugene that is guided by an annual work plan that's created by the members of the commission with help and input from Eugene's dedicated staff. It's not a commission or a body that can take on everything. So that's important to think about going forward and again, we have a recent example of the NLA, is a lot of the work that is done after something is formed involves developing a work plan, which sets some expectations for what it can and can't do. Yes, Bruce.
Ian, how many people are in Eugene's Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement Office?
That I don't know. Emily, if you're on the call, did you happen to get any sense of how big that office is?
Yeah, I believe the office has 3 members, one of which is, I don't know if his whole job is working with their commission, but that is part of his job exclusively, is working with this commission. But the office itself has 3 full employees.
Okay, so that's helpful context. A small office of 3, one person is pretty much full-time working with this body. Does that answer the question, Bruce? Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to move through the Beaverton content. Now, this is not from Beaverton. This is content that we generated. Again, thank you, Emily, based on looking at Beaverton's code and talking to Beaverton. It's really fairly similar to how Eugene has put things together. So let's move to the next slide. And I don't think there's anything particularly critical that we need to talk about on this slide. So let's advance one more. I'm going to try to spend about 5 more minutes. So this kind of gets into some of the mechanics. I think this is worth talking about. Beaverton's Human Rights Commission has 13 members. They have a youth liaison, a council liaison, the police chief's a member, and they have some special engagement with their police department to discuss police-related issues. Eugene has 11 members with the city council liaison. They have support from that Office of Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement in Eugene. We've already talked about the budget issues, so let's move on to the next slide. Talked about the lawyers. So this is interesting. The commission's relationship with the city council. In both Eugene and Beaverton, these bodies are advisory. They make recommendations to both the Beaverton and Eugene city councils. How the recommendations get to the councils may work a little bit differently, in part because Eugene has that dedicated office. That is a part of what they do. I know that's not all of what the task force is talking about for Ben's commission if we get to the point of having one, but it's a bread and butter component of what these commissions do. It's not everything, but it's an important part of their work. Yes, Councillor Campbell.
Thank you so much, Ian. And thank you, Emily. Do they also have citizen oversight committees for the police departments?
That isn't what either of these particular bodies do, at least not in the way that exists in some other communities. To be honest, I'm not sure if Eugene has a separate body that does that or has that relationship with their police department, but that's not within. There's clearly engagement with the police department in these communities and police issues, but it's not in what most people would call an oversight capacity. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, Juan. Thank you. So this is something that we were discussing a little bit earlier. How do complaints get handled? And in Beaverton, it seems to us, from what we can tell, that the complaints and issues largely go to the staffer that is assigned to their committee, and the staffer really does some connecting to resources in terms of referrals to other places in the city, which could include the police department, their housing unit. We don't have that in Bend, at least not the way I think Beaverton does. Or that staff person can try to make connections with the mediation and dialogue program that their commission offers. So it doesn't sound like these are things that go, for example, directly to the commission for the commission to hear and decide as a body what to do. There's this intermediary role of a staff person. In Eugene, it's a little bit similar in that complaints go through their Office of Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement, which can make referrals, get the police department involved, and can only take enforcement action in limited circumstances where the city's a party. The committee or the commission itself only addresses complaints on a policy level, doesn't really try to resolve or find resolution for individual complaints in a discrete fashion. My guess is that the commission in Eugene might have been involved in setting up this system, because if you look at Eugene's code, it says that their commission shall cooperate with the city in ensuring that the city is receiving, referring, and or investigating specific acts of discrimination against individuals in the community. So that's a provision in Eugene's code that says one thing that their commission is supposed to do. My guess is that they have handled that or facilitate that by having this system where individual complaints of discrimination go to their Office of Human Rights and Neighborhood Involvement, and then actions or connections are taken or made from there. So it doesn't sort of sit there and serve as a tribunal or conduct its own investigations, as far as we can tell, in either one of those communities. So next slide. And I think we are getting near the end. We are at the point where we can try to answer questions if you have any.
Ian, when you say getting near the end, do you mean questions about your part of the presentation, or is it near the end?
Yes. My personal timeline was to try to wrap up this section by around 4:05. So, I'll tell you, the enforcement issue is maybe one worth discussing if you have questions. It doesn't look like Beaverton or Eugene, again, their commissions don't sit as a tribunal and decide amongst themselves how to make connections or try to find resolution. There's staff assistance in each of those communities in trying to make that happen on individual complaints. And that's not to say that an individual complaint couldn't influence, work that those commissions did or recommendations they made or bigger picture solutions they tried to find, but it doesn't look like they really sit in that capacity and try to solve those individual problems.
So I guess that does then raise the question from the short-term task force. Do you see this as being similar to either the Bend or Eugene model, or is it something a little bit different, perhaps a little bit more robust?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more a question for the task force members. To me, my interpretation of the task force is that they're seeking maybe a more direct or anticipating more of a direct role for this body in Bend than the comparable bodies in Eugene and Beaverton seem to take.
My sense of it is that we do think that we would like to play a more direct, the commission should play a more direct role. Whether it's completely independent of city agencies or people, I'm not sure that we've thought that through. The thought was, when we discussed this, that the commission ought to be a forum where people from the minority community that we seek to serve ought to be able to have direct contact with the commission. And in some sense, they might be more comfortable doing that rather than going through a purely city agency where there might be some more reluctance to open up. So to the extent possible, I think the commission would like to be able to communicate directly with complainants or take complaints. I don't see that it's possible to do that without the city's involvement, because to receive complaints, there's a procedural issue involved. And if a complaint is sufficiently serious, then we ought to be able to have help in addressing possible solutions. And that also would involve help from the city. But I do think we have in mind, or had in mind, the ability to communicate directly with complainants.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit, just from my recollection with Welcoming Week last year in September. Through that, I think we learned, in terms of what Dr. Chattery was explaining there, is that more of a peer-to-peer engagement seems to be more approachable versus directly with the city. And maybe that's something that is discussed, but in learning from Welcoming Week, there seemed to be that reluctance of coming directly to the city. So I just want us to be mindful of that going forward, and have the commission, to discuss that. And maybe there's a certain tier, if it gets to a certain escalation point, that then it goes, to a city direction. My follow-up too on that, I was just curious what direct conversations, maybe Chatterjee, you might have been able to explain this, but what direct conversations have we had with members of Eugene and Beaverton that may be helpful to us in terms of best practices? What were things that, when they started this, that they were, moving forward and they changed direction? Was it in this area of complaint? Was it in the area of specific guidelines, or how they even created a commission?
So if maybe I can jump in real quick and just say I don't, unless individual members of the task force reached out, I don't know that we had any direct communication with staff there. I know I reached out to Beaverton a while back, but I never heard back from them. So a lot of my more direct information I kind of got through Joshua, who'd had conversations with in the past. So I don't know if we can speak to kind of that timeline around the decisions. Ramir, I don't know if you've had other communication with them that you can speak to.
I certainly have not had any direct communications, and I'm not aware of anyone in the group that spoke to anyone directly. So I'm afraid I can't answer that.
I'm sorry, Councillor Piper. I actually have we have a mid-sized city coalition that we've begun building that includes the city of Eugene and Beaverton. We just had a call yesterday. I have a follow-up with the city manager of Eugene to really get more information. So I'm happy to follow up on that question and then provide a response when we consider this at the full council meeting on August 19th.
That would be helpful. That was going to be my follow-up, to put that forth as a recommendation. Thank you.
Unless there's any other questions, what I might do, just we are a little bit short on time. I know we have one presenter that is on our next item that has a hard stop at probably 4:25. So I might just ask, unless there's any major issues with what you've heard today, which I have not sensed, that will proceed in presenting this information to the full council on August 19th in a work session to then move forward and putting some of these items, particularly the creation of a Human Rights Commission, into the city code.
I have no questions. Again, comments, I may be repeating myself, but I really want to commend the work of everyone involved in this process and being patient as those of us who are not as brought up to speed, and some of the questions or concerns. I think you guys, in a very non-defensive, were able to help us understand better. And I know I can certainly be a champion for this effort at our council meeting on the 19th.
I echo Councillor Abernathy, and definitely be a champion and advocate going forward and on August 19th.
Ditto. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all for your good questions. It's helpful.
Thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Ramir, and others. I can't, it's hard to see everybody on the call, but I just, again, really appreciate it. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda, which is also a carryover from a few weeks ago, and that's to discuss the coronavirus relief funds, or CRF. There's been lots of twists and turns, but as you all know, part of the initial CARES Act that was passed, the $2.5 trillion, a portion of that went to the states, and the Treasury Department suggested about 45% of that be distributed to local government, so cities and counties. When you do the math, that means about 600 million potentially could be available. Not all of that has been released. It's been somewhat of a challenge to get the money out, but there has been some progress. We got reimbursed for a few $100,000 of our expenses in this first tranche of about 50 million that was set aside. And then there's an additional 200 million that has been set aside with a focus around economic support. There's kind of three simple guidelines from the Treasury Department. It has to be coronavirus related expenses. It has to be for a period of, I believe it's March 15th through the end of the calendar year. And it can't be used to backfill any funds. And then it can be used for economic support. So this tranche of funding that's available, we'd like to focus around that community and economic resiliency. We changed the council goals to reflect this and talked at our last meeting about a framework. And so we'd like to now put the funding to that framework. And so what's been allocated to BEN, just based on our population. So there's a simple formula that's been put together, and we have received notification that we will be awarded 2.6 million that could be granted out. So what we're here today to do is to present a broad outline of that plan for intended use of that 2.6 million. What we really want to do is rely on our partners, and that's really the intent of the Stewardship Subcommittee, is really partnering with agencies to help do the necessary work. So we'll talk about that because we didn't want to be a direct allocator to individual businesses or organizations. So that's not something that we are well poised to do, but we have many partners in our region or city that do that work. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you could advance the next slide. So I covered some of this already, but just so we can keep moving. This was the goals that you all heard about, and then the council adopted at your last meeting on July 15th. We did amend. There was some discussion. I think Councilor Mosley brought up some amendments, so we did incorporate the sort of the clarification of vulnerable populations, including those that are elderly or have underlying medical, to broaden some of the language a bit. So that has been incorporated. You keep going. And so the framework is of the 2.6 million, we're proposing to dedicate $1 million to business and community assistance. And we're proposing a partnership with the Bend Chamber to get funding out to small businesses. And we want to have Katie Brooks sort of talk to you about that program. And that's the individual that has a time constraint. So I'm going to really quickly turn it over to her. And we'll talk about childcare. Well, in addition to that, there's city costs that we just get reimbursed for, about 600,000 of that 2.6 million, funding allocated for childcare and then assistance for vulnerable populations. So Tracy, I'm going to come back to you so that we give Katie a chance to speak. So we'll come back to some of the more technical kind of considerations for the use of these funds. And I want Tracy Stabler from our finance department to go through that. But we'll come back to that after we give Katie a chance to share the Chamber's proposal on the resiliency grants. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie Brooks.
Great, thanks. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep, good. I've had to pipe you in through my phone. I don't know what was going on with my computer. Hello, everyone. I wanted to share with you what we're proposing to do to get the grants out the door and expedited fashion in a fair way. As you know, we have been distributing at the Chamber, we've been distributing grants for various uses through the COVID crisis. And this is the next iteration of what we think is a logical next step. Do you want to go ahead and forward? I'm not sure I can. So we're looking at this as 3 different phases of getting assistance out. The first one was to stay home, stay safe. I won't go into details of what all these things were, but we as a chamber got involved in a lot of things focused around getting information to people so they know what the latest info was and where to find emergency funding. The next phase was the reopening phase, and this is where the Boost Up Bend Fund came in. We started with $40,000 from the Oregon Community Foundation, grew it to almost $100,000. We got that out in about 2.5 to 3 weeks. And helped a lot of folks with the startup costs. These costs were things like plexiglass and rearranging furniture and personnel costs, etc. And this final phase is about really helping people figure out how to go it for the long go. And this is where the resiliency funds from the city would help. We would get these grants out the door to assist folks in bridging that gap of costs that really are associated with changing your business model. It might be tech, it might be added personnel, it might be inventory changes, physical changes to the space. Whatever it is, to get folks moving towards what am I going to do if I have to go through this for the next 6 to 12 months. And that's what we're talking about with these grants. Next slide. And more specifically, these are kind of, at this point, we're fine-tuning it, but I think you'll get the point when we go through these. So the resiliency grants would be awarded to businesses registered and operating in Bend, about 50 FTEs, full-time equivalents or less. So that's more on the small side of businesses, and we would distribute grants of $5,000 to $40,000 for a sole proprietor or someone just with one or two folks that work for them in a small shop. $5,000 may be sufficient, but if you're talking about 50 FTEs, to have a little more flexibility to give some more cash would make a better impact. So that's why the range. And then this is federal. We can't duplicate funding from the previous funding sources from the Fed. So that's EIDL, PPP. So in other words, if you were Katie's Ice Cream Shop and I got a PPP loan for $100,000 for my people to pay for a certain amount of time, I couldn't use this new money for the same purpose. It would have to be a new purpose. And so we really look at these resiliency grants as forward-looking rather than backward-looking, if that makes sense. Next slide. So this goes over, oh, I skipped one. The Grant Selection Committee, what we did with the Boost Up Bend funds was try and bring in a lot of different eyeballs that weren't just chamber folks. These obviously will go out to the full business community, these grants will. So we'll have a representative, potentially from the city of Bend, a BDAB member, DEI business support or a business owner, or someone from the SBDC that knows how to work with DEI businesses. Then next, a board member. So this is going through our 501c3 portion of the chamber rather than our C6. And it has a lot to do with, because this money is federal, it will flow much more smoothly if we use that C3 status rather than the C6. So somebody from our Bend Next C3 will be sitting on that panel, and then a banking representative, especially one who has been through a lot of these PPP grants and so forth, who knows what to look for, and it could be helpful on the fiduciary end. Next slide. So timeline is pretty swift. Like I said, we got our Boost Up Bend grants out in probably about 3 weeks. What we want to do is put out the call for applications for a couple of weeks, let the word get out, we'll market it in a variety of settings and through a variety of partners. So we get a full spectrum of participation from all walks and parts of the city, including DEI. And then after that, in September, we'll start to look through that first round and start selecting the recipients through our panel. Distribution will probably start, I would say, in mid to late September. My guess is by October, we're probably going to be close to done. But what we want to do is look at our parameters. Are we hitting the right FTE status? How many applicants were there in comparison to how much money we had? With the Boost Up Bend funds, and you'll find this to be fairly redundant with the other funds that are have been distributed in other entities around the region, you get between 2 and 3, maybe even more, depending on the fund, times as many requests as you have money. So I don't expect to go back and have to reassess and tweak any of the requirements in the application process, but I wanted to build in enough time in case we did need to. And then by November, that would complete the final funds and close it out. Now, what happens as soon as we start distributing funds? One of the questions we'll have on the application is, what are you going to use this money for? The feds want us to ask it. And also, we want to understand, is there something this business needs that might be out of their wheelhouse? For example, if you're an ice cream shop and you don't know what a curated ice cream delivery or an online e-commerce presence looks like, you have to go outside to hire somebody else to do that. But it might be really handy to also have an expert help walk you through some of the major aspects of that. So in this application process, we're not only asking how would you use the money, how many FTEs you have, et cetera. We also want to know what expertise are you going to need to help you with this. And we'll set up webinars only for the grant recipients that focus on feedback directly from these applications. So we're getting them expertise in areas that will help them spend their money wisely. And then we're going to track this data over time and track several several markers. Number one is, are you in business? Revenue, exactly how you use the money, how many employees you have, and whether or not you need any other expert or additional assistance. And we'll try and follow up with that with webinars and putting them in touch with a stable of experts that we have developed throughout the region. So I think that's it. One more slide, or is that it? I think that's it. So that gives you the gist of how we would identify who would receive these grants, how we're going to go out and ask folks for applications to be submitted, and then get it out the door. So again, I'm pretty confident we'll be able to do this by late fall and have a little bit of padding to adjust those webinars and start tracking data. But the federal requirement is that every last penny must be distributed by December 31st of this year. And I'm very confident we'll be able to do that. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I want to focus on questions for Katie, and then we will come back to that overall framework that I talked about. And you're going to hear from the two other components, Shelley talking about vulnerable populations, Ben talking about childcare. So we can kind of round out there, but before Katie has to leave, I want to make sure that you get any questions addressed now.
Yeah, I have no questions. I think it's a great idea, and it's a delight to have somebody like the Ben Chamber that has experience and a track record of being able to get this money out in a responsible way.
And I'll just close one. Thank you, Katie and the Chamber, for pulling this together too. I think the key component here is the support that follows the money for those businesses, so they can actually see a return, but also help them look at maybe revising their business plan so there is some sustainability going forward. And obviously the Chamber has a great pool of resources through their membership to help support that, as well as outlying businesses too. So thanks for your presentation.
You bet.
Hi, Katie. Thank you so much. So you talked about oversight for the money as it's going out. Is there oversight of the Chamber's distribution? Do you see what I'm asking?
I think so. Let me try and answer that. So because of the size of these grants, what we have to do is we have to go through a formal audit because they're federal. So
right.
We'll hire an entity, so we have a third party looking over our shoulder, making sure that we follow the protocols. And we'll provide that report to the council.
That's great. Thanks so much, Katie. Every store I go into, I talk about how many masks you have purchased in addition to the masks that we have at the city, and just singing your praises and making sure all of our, at least the businesses that I'm going into, that they know that you're there for them to be able to, that was really important to me. We don't want people to turn away customers. We want them to hand them a mask. So thanks so much for that and for this work as well.
You bet. It's a great partnership between the city and the Chamber.
All right. Thank you, Katie. We'll let you go. Good luck with your board meeting.
Thank you.
So maybe if we could step back, actually, that was a good segue, Councillor Campbell. I'm going to have Tracy Stabler talk about the financial requirements and the agreements that we need to have in place to give you a little bit of context before we go back to the plan and talk about childcare and assistance of vulnerable populations. So I think one more slide back, one. There you go, right there. So I'm going to turn it over to Tracy to just kind of walk you through some of the requirements.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are. Go ahead. You sound good.
Sorry, I just want to make sure you're hearing me. Good afternoon. Yeah, I think Eric started the meeting kind of making it very clear that there were a couple of overriding rules that both the Treasury Department and the state of Oregon has put on it. All the expenses have to be related to COVID-19 in some way. They have to be sole source expenditures, meaning you don't double dip with any other source of federal or state monies, and that you actually expend the money, and it's a strange date, but it's 12/30, not 12/31. We're not quite sure if they just want that extra day to review things or not, but those funds have to be out the door to the end user. So not only will it have to be out the door to our grant recipients, it has to be to the ultimate recipient through the chambers. So that's why there's a lot of a big timeline on getting these out. So what we're doing right now is putting together the grant agreement so we have them ready. The Treasury has issued guidance saying what they feel are acceptable expenditures. They put them in a lot of categories that relate to public health, that relate to communications, to teleworking, to what you can consider economic support or assistance. And the state has incorporated that into the grant agreement that they sent to us. We're now incorporating that into the grant agreements that we have to abide. I don't know if you recall the 2008 recession when all the ARA monies come out, but when those monies were sent out as stimulus packages, the federal government came out and demanded certain requirements on the single audit and required all of them to be audited, required all of them to have an extra level of risk assigned to it. And we're working on the assumption that that's what's going to happen to this. In fact, the Secretary of State has already announced that they're starting real-time audits of the expenditures and the distribution of these funds. So we're incorporating into our grant agreements that all of the entities we deal with will have to require their recipients to respond to an audit, and that they'll have to respond to us to an audit. We'll also incorporate, I believe affordable housing has started with the monies they've received, is developing a certification that will ask everyone to sign that will certify that they're not spending these funds on anything other than what they applied for, and that in fact they're not receiving any other type of funds to spend on the same expenditures. I don't know if you had any.
No, thank you, Tracy. I just wanted to make sure that the council knew that there's a lot of rigor that goes into federal funds, and we're going to be very diligent in our distribution following those guidelines. So thank you, Tracy. You can keep, just so we can keep moving. I think you already kind of covered the next slide, which was the timeline.
Eric,
any questions for Tracy? Go ahead.
Sir Abernathy had a question.
Yeah, real quickly, I'll go back a slide. And I don't know the level of detail that Ben's going to be asking or providing around the childcare. So what I'm hearing is, like, if I were looking through a childcare lens, this can only be for COVID-related expenses, i.e., additional cleaning costs. Does it include the fact that you can only getting half the kids there? I mean, help me and what that, or is that a question I should ask Ben when Ben goes?
No, actually, it's a good question. They actually have put out a lot of FAQs that discuss particular scenarios, and they're trying to be very broad and general, but you have to relate it to COVID-19. So a lot of these expenditures, if you can justify it to having to make changes to your business in response to COVID-19, they're considering that valid. So if you need to make structural changes to accomplish social distancing, if you have to make changes in your staffing, one of the requirements is that if it was an unbudgeted expense that's addressing a new requirement due to COVID-19, that's a valid expense also. So, as long as you can relate it back to, you would not have done this for other than the fact that COVID-19 is forcing you to address it, then you can consider it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's keep moving, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk about childcare as the next outline of our plan to allocate these funds.
Perfect. Thanks, Eric. Hello, Council. Ben Hempson, City Business Advocate, and Councilor Abernathy. Always ask the experts before you ask me, so thank you for asking Tracy that question. So we have the title slide up there. You saw it. So this is a proposed allocation for childcare, really with two partners, Neighbor Impact and Ben Parks and Rec. I'll talk a little bit about the nuance and how this may be allocated in a second, but you can see the recommended allocation up there if you can jump ahead one. All right, so before we start talking about the allocation, I think it's important to look at the landscape of childcare in Bend. If we go back to the before times, early March, when we were talking about childcare as a council goal, really dating back to January, right? We knew we had about 5,000 childcare slots active in Bend. We needed about 8,000. And there was a council goal to add about 650 by the end of your 2-year council goal period, June of 2021. Things have changed a lot. There have been a lot of hard hit industries in Bend. I think you could find some that have been equally as hard hit as childcare, but it would be difficult to find any that have been harder hit than childcare. And what you can see up here on the screen, a bar chart showing pre-COVID capacity and neighbor impact. Our partners there provided this in terms of childcare slots available, and then post-COVID capacity. And one of the key drivers, especially on the two on the left, commercial centers, so your kind of traditional childcare you could drive up to in a commercial area, of course, or maybe an industrial one as well, or family childcare, so home-based childcare up to 16 children in a home. Both of those have been hit by those capacity restrictions that have come down from OHA, and also emergency childcare operator guidelines that these operators are running under as well. So we've seen a stark drop in commercial centers that can run. Some of these requirements that are restricting them along with capacity are cohort requirements. So if your child goes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you can't be mixing with a child that goes Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or vice versa down the line. So very strict requirements around staffing and just capacity in general. I should mention here too, when you look at this, those blue bars account for 5,050 total childcare slots in Bend. The red bars, so what's remaining right now, is we have 1,628 available spots. So certainly when Carolyn and I talk about this, so childcare is kind of the fulcrum to get back to work, right? Everything's going to rotate around this as we talk about dual income families, single parents, folks that are working in retail and non-home based work right now. We need to have this childcare capacity available. Our focus so far has not been on school age children, and I'll touch on that on the next slide, but neighbor impact, we followed their guidelines and really focused before COVID on centers, family, and preschools, right? And school age services and programs are coming out of Bend Parks and Rec in partnership with the Bend La Pine School District. But of course, we have a dire need. The governor's made some statements today showing that we may be going back to school in the fall in person in some form, but that could actually accentuate the need for this kind of after school or intermediate care for school age children, where if you're going to school Monday through Wednesday and then have Thursday, Friday off as a student, we're going to need to figure something out there. So,
yeah, and Ben, I'm happy to maybe interject here. I've had some conversations with Don Horton with Parks and Rec, and I think the vision here, we just don't know a lot, but the vision would be that there'd be some additional resources to families in need to help pay for an after-school childcare. Parks and Rec already has a grant program or a scholarship program, but the thinking is that there's going to be a lot more need come this fall. So a portion, I think it's envisioned that a portion of these funds could help offset and keep that as an option for families to use that Kids Inc. program that's so popular. And we're working also within our organization to help identify some locations, some facilities that are nearby schools, given that there might be some issues with just even the capacity, having the physical space to be able to operate before and after school childcare. So helping to partner and look for alternative arrangements there as well.
Thanks, Eric.
I wanted to just add one.
In fact, I literally just got an email from Laura Nordquist at 4:20, and she said, Department of Education has just released some guidelines, and she said, based on these metrics, if school were starting today, Bend La Pine schools would not be able to reopen in our physical buildings as we had planned. Instead, we would provide comprehensive distance learning for students with the possibility of some in-person instruction for grades K to 3. So in order to actually get people back to work, it doesn't look like there's necessarily going to be school opportunity for them. So that throws another monkey wrench in that.
Oh, sorry, Councilor Piper.
No, I was just going to add, and maybe this is part of the presentation, Ben, but in BDAB, there was a conversation around childcare and, the space that could come available within some of the commercial buildings where there are employees that are now telecommuting and not coming back, just staying home. But in order to do that, there needs to be some code amendments to make that happen. One specifically was bathrooms. Where in a lot of these commercial buildings, the bathrooms are outside of the actual place where kids could potentially be. So that was something that I just wanted to bring up, and so we don't forget about that.
Yeah, it's a great point. Juan, could you go to the next slide? Because I'll wrap it up here. And while I don't dive into those, this is a high level overview, but the items you're pointing out, I think, are why we're saying 300,000 neighbor impact and Ben Parks and Rec, but there isn't a clear allocation just yet on how much would go to each one. But let me touch on here some recent allocations and why neighbor impact is such a great partner on this on the non-school age side of the childcare assistance. So you'll each remember fairly recently allocating $50,000 from the city of Bend, matched by Deschutes County for childcare to neighbor impact. And they have neighbor impact is a pretty elegant way of actually getting that money out the door, and they do it quickly. As you can see, within 3 weeks, they just make allocations based on slots that are not usable right now due to capacity restrictions. So if you're a childcare that normally had 90 and you're operating at 60, they run a formula to essentially help subsidize those slots that you just are not able to access right now because of restrictions. And that goes back to your question to Tracy, Bruce, around how they can use those funds. The great thing, as I briefly said, is neighbor impact gets this money out quickly. When we said how much can you get out the door, if it came now or if it came in October or December, their response was as much as you give us. So they're hand delivering checks. They're fighting over who to get those checks to, or who gets to deliver the checks to childcare providers, and are really making sure that they account for it in a way that doesn't conflict with point number 2 there, which is the State Early Learning Division CARES Act grants. Those typically went to larger childcare centers, allocations between $9,000 and $18,000. And again, just like all of these other funds, need to make sure we're not double dipping, paying for the same thing twice with neighbor impact or early learning division or any future allocation from the city of Bend for these childcare providers. So the nuance here is, of course, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the fall with school yet, but we have a nice backstop, and this ties in with the staff recommendations at the bottom. We have a nice backstop in terms of neighbor impacts for we allocated, and I'm just pulling a number out here, 150,000 to neighbor impact now, and tried to pursue some assistance with the Ben Parks and Rec in the future would be able to, pursue the allocation with Ben Parks and Rec now, but we couldn't make things happen or schools just didn't open. We could turn around and give that money to neighbor impact, and they would get it out the door in an effective manner. Yeah, Councilor Abernathy.
And quick question, can you help me understand, one of the previous slides said the thinking was 300,000 for childcare. How does that crosswalk with this slide I'm looking at right now? Are any of those bullets part of that 300,000 or some of these above and beyond?
These are good question. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, these are above and beyond, but the neighbor impact I included as a proof of concept, essentially, that they're more than capable of getting the money out the door to childcare providers. The Early Learning Division CARES Act grants, just wanted you to be aware of them because those allocations are coming out right now, and don't want council to get confused about what
Thank you.
And let you know there's a mechanism to make sure we're not running into conflict. So I touched on, and Eric really covered the Parks and Rec side of this, but happy to answer questions before we move on.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over now to Shelley to talk about our approach in serving vulnerable populations.
Sure. So this information is based on the project.
Oh, Shelley, your audio cut out.
Looks like she froze.
Shelley, are you back up yet?
Yeah.
Oh,
slow bandwidth across
Okay.
the city, because I'm having the same issue. I'm seeing everything slowing down. So
Yeah, I am
give it a
too.
few seconds.
Okay.
Can you hear me
I think
now?
Shelley, yep, I think you're back on. Go ahead.
About the video, maybe that'll help.
Everybody's still frozen. So Shelley, I didn't.
Not so much.
Still not hearing you. It looks like everybody's unfrozen.
Are we back?
Shelley, I know you're in the office. If you want to come to my office and
can't hear
present,
anything
that
now.
might be an option for you. And I can step out.
Sure. Let me try
I was
that.
going to say, Shelley, if you want to just come and you can present on my computer, I'll step out and give you my computer. Okay, let's do that.
Okay, you're
So,
cutting out too on mine. Hang out here.
I'm just going to step away and I'll have Shelley present here.
I think we're coming back.
You're fine.
I think we might be coming back. Wow.
Okay. Sorry. Great. All right, we're back. So as I was saying, some of this is based on the council goal revisions that you all received at the last Stewardship Subcommittee. And the goal of these funds is to distribute to vulnerable populations. And so the staff recommendation is a $700,000 allocation to two organizations, Neighbor Impact and United Way of Central Oregon. So Juan, do you want to go ahead and advance the slide? So what we were thinking about is the Neighbor Impact. They have a rental and mortgage assistance program with the potential eviction moratorium coming up in the near future and Neighbor Impact running out of rental and mortgage assistance as of October 1, that we would allocate a portion, $200,000 towards this, this expense. They are poised to be able to accept those funds and distribute them between October and the end of December. They have already distributed over $3 million as of September. So I think we're trusting that their ability to get those funds out, similarly to the chamber and to other organizations, is within the scope of the parameters of this grant money. They can also match the CRF funding with existing CARES funding and make sure that there's no double dipping, but that it could be leveraged grant money, which would be great. Then the other allocation would be to United Way. And United Way, as you all know, they've been in our community for over 60 years. And they have a grant process that they've started. It's called the COVID-19 Recovery and Resilience Grant Partner Program. And they'll be able to translate the funds that we're projecting to allocate $500,000 out into the community and get those distributed to a wide variety of vulnerable populations. The funding priorities for this grant, for this federal money, would be really a two-part process. One, us looking at how do we define vulnerable populations in the city of Bend, and then how, using their guidance and their expertise, directing how we promote those applications. And any nonprofit in the city of Bend would be able to apply for those funds. So any remaining funds after that process would be dispersed either through Neighbor Impact or United Way, depending on what the greatest need was. Yeah, Bruce.
Shelley, so quick question. I know a little bit about the Neighbor Impact Rental and Mortgage Assistance Program. There, the funds are going directly to individual families who apply. Talk to me a little bit more about the United Way process. Is that going directly to households, or is it going more to intermediaries, you know, Kovo, Shepherd's House, things along those lines? Help me understand the Way process.
So how United Way is dispersing the funds right now is they have an application process. So we would work closely with the United Way team to ensure that the components of this federal money are incorporated into their application process. Then that application process would be sent out over a 2 to 3 week period to various nonprofits in the region or in the area to have them apply for the fund. So it would go to a nonprofit from United Way to be dispersed out to their clients.
And I'm just, you know, that makes sense because that's been the United Way model for many years. I'm curious why staff is recommending the breakdown of 200,000 and 500,000. What was the thinking about that?
Yeah, so good question. So as you probably know, there are other agencies receiving rental assistance and mortgage assistance. One of those is Thrive of Central Oregon. And in talking with Sarah Kelly from Thrive today, I think, and talking with Scott Cooper from Neighbor Impact, if we look at the period of October through December, I think the allocation of $200,000 makes sense in the pace of how Neighbor Impact has been distributing those funds. And Thrive of Central Oregon has funds for rental and mortgage assistance that they can delay distributing until Neighbor Impact's funding is depleted. So really trying to work number, and there might be some adjustment there. I guess we want to hear from you as counselors if you have questions about the amounts, but I think we're looking at that 200,000 and 500,000 distribution for those reasons.
Thank you.
Are there other questions around Neighbor Impact or United Way or their process? What I really like is that United Way has concentrated on an equity framework, and we'll be using that equity framework, and we'll be working closely with them to make sure that the state's equity framework is engaged and used in this process as well. Okay, next slide.
So, Shelley, this is just so quick. We are talking about housing here. We're not talking about businesses. Is that right? Private homes for people?
You mean the rental and mortgage assistance? Yes, exactly. We're talking about, citizens, members of our community.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I just want to say that thanks to Central Oregon Health Council, United Way, Neighbor Impact. We received this information about a week ago, and they've been very quick to respond around some framework that they could provide. And so I just wanted to say thank you to them, as we've talked with them quite extensively. Okay, I'll hand it back to Eric.
Okay. So I think that was the end of our presentation, and I just want to, I guess, check in with council again on that sort of high level framework. 2.6 million available, about 600,000 will be just reimbursement for our own expenses. We've done our own kind of cost assumptions with our finance department and our city staff, and we feel comfortable with that 600,000 of the 2.6 for our organizational needs. But the other 2 million, roughly $1 million to kind of businesses to support, and then $1 million kind of divvied up between childcare assistance.
Lost you, Eric.
Eric is.
Yeah. Yeah,
We lost you there for a little bit, Eric. Sorry.
I don't know how much of that you got, but I'm just looking for kind of to see how comfortable you are with the outline that we've presented.
I'm comfortable with the outline. Thank you.
Okay, so looks like Barb, a thumbs up. Bruce?
Eric, does it make sense? Because I'm noticing another Eric on the on the discussion, Eric Kansler, and because the 2.6 million is what we know we're going to be getting. Any thoughts or ideas on some of the other stuff may or may not be being held back, or is that?
Yeah, in fact,
is that premature at this stage?
I think, and actually Eric just let me know that he just came from a meeting that was related to this topic. So yeah, I'm going to ask Eric if you could join us and kind of giving us the latest update on potential additional funds.
Sure, sounds good, and thank you for the question. So I did just come from a call with a number of other city lobbyists and some folks with the counties as well, because we continue to advocate for more coronavirus relief funds from the state. We really only have $200 million committed for local governments thus far. The federal treasury guidelines suggest that we should be getting local governments collectively $624 million. So we only have a small portion of that, thus the advocacy for additional funding continues. The state has been holding a lot of money back, and I think largely in light of their own budget deficit and waiting to see how that unfolds. So there is a lot more money the state can give us. The question is, how do we compel them to do so? And one of the ways that we're trying to make the point is by illustrating the nature of the investments that are being made, partnered investments at the local level, exactly the sort of stuff you're talking about today. I think that these sorts of local partnerships are compelling. And in fact, Eric, I just sent you and Ben and Shelley an email where we can, potentially follow up and help tell this story to not just our delegation, but the governor's office and others, to say, look, we know you're putting out a lot of money for a lot of good things, but there's a lot that we can do uniquely at the local level, but we need your support. So it's an all-out push for that. I don't know what the prospects are, but in light of the fact that they're holding money back, it's been a difficult road.
Thank you.
Yeah, and again, I think we've talked to this group. We'll continue to look for opportunities to have you help share in that story, that message. It's been challenging because a lot of the decisions are being made and through their emergency board, which it doesn't include a legislative process. It's the Speaker of the House, Senate President, and Governor's office. So we'll continue to hopefully try to push and seek your help in doing so. All right. Well, I think that concludes the time that we have today, and that's the sort of the end of our content. And it's about 5 o'clock. So I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
I'll second.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
All right.